This video is going to be a little different in regards to focus. The last Saturday video was about writing the romance genre, and I realized that I could also talk about detective fiction as a genre. Why detective fiction? Well, that's a bit of a strange story. I am very neutral in regards to detective fiction. I enjoy it, and I'd like to write it someday, but I haven't had any good ideas for it quite yet. But it's not really something I really go out of my way for either. My connection to detective fiction comes from 2 separate years of undergraduate university. There were multiple classes in a row where every time I had to write a paper, the choices were detective fiction or whatever hyperfixation that specific professor had. As such, I kept picking detective fiction, and I accidentally learned a lot about a genre I hadn't really thought a whole lot about beforehand. This video is going to borrow heavily from a lot of my notes I made during that period. Detective fiction, as a specific section of the mystery genre, is one of those genres that seems to have been an accident. The expectations from the genre came from reader frustrations with early stories. For example, Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue, widely considered the first detective story, so to speak, still in the way we'd recognize at least, was liked by readers, but some were disappointed in a curious situation. They felt like the investigation was contrived. See, today, the most recognizable genre expectation in the detective fiction genre is the concept of fair play. That is, the reader or audience should be able to put the clues together as well and solve the mystery. Murders in the Rue Morgue came before fair play, so it's not solvable by the readers. At the same time, while the fair play rule has become the most well-known feature of detective fiction, it's not entirely because of the reasons you might think. Let's take a step back and look at story structure in general. The usual formats of plot, whether it's the monomyth, the beat sheet, or the story circle, tend to emphasize a turning point somewhere near the middle. In more contemporary storytelling, it actually leans a little past the middle, but the turning point is still there. Basically, before that point, the story presents questions, and after the point, the story begins answering them. Look at just about any published work that isn't experimental, and you will see this pattern. I predict that the fair play rule is a direct result of it. You see, it naturally follows that attentive readers and audiences want to make logical sense. They're willing to allow magic, monsters, crazy technology, and so on, but even those things are supposed to be able to logically connect to their respective worlds. In a space opera, if you have teleportation as well as spaceships, then you need to find a way for the teleporters to not be the default option. There needs to be a reason why sometimes you teleport and sometimes you don't. Therefore, the plot or the world building tends to pick up the slack in those areas. Combined, those principles likely are the reason for the fair play rule. The story begins by setting up the crime and laying out the evidence. Naturally, this is when the story is presenting all of its questions to the reader or audience as well. Keep in mind, this will include questions about the case, as well as the narrative questions that are to be expected in every other story, such as, who are these characters? What are their motives? How do they relate to one another? What's the flow of the story? And so on. As the story shifts into the second half and the questions begin to find answers, even if they are more questions themselves, there is a tricky situation to remember. Using my previous teleporter and spaceship example, these are 2 items that our main point of reference is the story itself, so we will tend to take the writer's word for it as long as the excuse isn't objectively bad. Detective fiction, though, will lead the readers or audience to naturally begin to try and put the evidence together themselves. If the story's second half answers are completely reliant on the writer's word and don't clearly connect to the earlier evidence, you can accidentally tick the readers or audience off because the logical chain they had been following was severed. In other words, because detective fiction makes the readers or audience pay close attention to detail, it becomes extremely important to keep those minute details consistent. To that end, research everything you're writing about as well as you can. You don't need to have a doctorate level of knowledge, but it can't be offensively incorrect to the reader's audience who might know a thing or two about the things you put in your world. Naturally, a vast majority of your readers and audience are not going to be detectives. As such, your characters need to do the heavy lifting on that front, while also making it understandable to the casuals. The most widely known solution for this is to have a detective character and a narrating character that asks questions. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson are the first that come to mind, but even in the aforementioned Murders in the Rue Morgue, which predates Sherlock Holmes, the Holmes type was Dupin, and he was accompanied by an unnamed narrator who acts similarly to Watson. It's a trope, but like all tropes, there is a reason why it started. It allows the mysterious, crazy smart detective to do all the far-reaching investigative actions, and then tell them to someone who stands in for the reader. It's a handy in-universe way of translating difficult information into something easier to digest. Seeing as how it is a trope, it is recommended to avoid it if you can. Yes, it works, but you'll catch flack using it. I think the best way is to simply make sure the way the evidence links together isn't completely abstract. Like, if your criminal is a professional janitor, maybe some evidence is that the victim was killed with mustard gas.
Okay, get this. I combined two common items in a powerful new way. I told my readers to harness the cleaning power of ammonia with the whitening power of bleach.
Ammonia and bleach? You told people to mix ammonia and bleach?
Only if they want bathroom fixtures that shine like the sun.
Peggy, that's the recipe for mustard gas.
Sure, that's probably not completely common knowledge, but most adults at some point are told why not to mix certain cleaning chemicals. So it's not too much of a leap for a reader or audience member to be like, oh, that makes sense, when cleaning chemicals are used like that in a story. In other words, you wouldn't need a detective character as built different as Sherlock Holmes, and so you wouldn't need a character to filter any information to the reader or audience. You may, however, run into difficulties if you are certain you want the mystery in the story to be extra difficult. At that point, I suggest taking an approach tailored to your specific story instead of an actual packaged trope. Something to consider when writing a mystery as a whole, but especially detective fiction, is the importance of making sure the story remains fair and balanced in how it handles topics. Detective fiction implies some sort of legal punishment, or at least an attempt at one, so there is a risk of writing subtext you didn't intend. You do not want to be accused of writing a story just to put a person of ideology you disagree with behind bars, albeit fictional ones. The antagonist needs to be bad, but don't imply they are bad and deserve punishment because they are depicted as having disagreeing stances with you. It's not a hole that's easy to crawl out of. Once you're branded as being too tilted, then the only people willing to help you are the ones who also have their own motives and probably don't actually care about you. The solution is to make sure your characters really are individuals. A helpful practice I recommend is writing the occasional short story where the protagonist believes in the opposite stances of you, and the antagonist completely agrees with you. Then, focus on making the personalities of both in such a way that the story still works. Sure, you probably won't publish anything like that, but the purpose of the exercise is to get you out of your own head. The rigidity of detective fiction steers most newer writers away from the genre as they think they will never get the chance to write something memorable or even original in a genre with expectations so straightforward. However, I like to give an example of detective fiction that shows just how far the mold can be stretched. Admittedly, I haven't sat down and read this book for a while, but I still remember what I want to talk about. I really recommend reading Rudolph Fisher's The Conjure Man Dies if you haven't. It takes place in Harlem, and as it was first published in 1932, it has a very 1920s aesthetic to it, which really adds to the classic detective fiction feel. It starts with a murder, and soon the reader is given a look at the possible suspects and the first two detectives. I say the first two because this book experiments quite a bit and ends up having two more main detectives to follow. What makes it so interesting to me? Well, the victim isn't actually who the book first implies it to be. See, the title is called The Conjure Man Dies, and the Conjure Man in question is Nagana Frimbo. But, as it is later revealed, Frimbo didn't die. Rather, his assistant, someone Frimbo also calls Frimbo, is the actual victim. Therefore, one of the 4 detectives is actually the character you originally thought was the victim. On top of that, because he was the intended victim, we have the curious situation of a detective investigating his own murder, which he makes clear note of. Another way the book shows its prowess is in the character of Dr. John Archer, who is supposed to be the Holmes type. He's a financially struggling medical doctor who took on the case because he was bored and wanted to show off his knowledge. However, he ends up being the detective that covers the least ground. Even Bumper Brown, a mostly comic relief character, actually gets more overall work done, even if a lot of it is unintentional. One of the points the book tends to make is a showcase of the problems of looking at everything subjectively, that is, only from your own perspective. Of the 4 detectives, the least effective is Archer because he only relies on his own knowledge and is dismissive of the suggestions of others. Frimbo himself is the most effective because he is able to look at it from a broad spectrum of perspectives, including Archer's rigid scientific model, but also a spiritual model. This isn't supposed to be a book report, but I want you to see that a detective narrative doesn't have to be cookie-cutter at all, and yet still meet genre expectations. The Conjureman Dies is completely different from what one would expect a typical detective novel to be, and yet it still presents a mystery, the evidence, the detectives working the case, and lets the reader put the clues together along the way. Of course, that's not the only book to test the limits of what the genre can do. Wilkie Collins's The Moonstone also tries a lot of things out, but you probably get my point. It brings in a larger discussion I think it's important for all writers to get a grasp on. See, when those of us who teach creative writing talk about genre expectations and the rules of fiction, it is not about restrictions or stopping creativity. The rules of fiction are the culmination of what every writer before you has already learned the hard way. It's not an arbitrary, don't do that because I said so, but rather a, people have tried it and it doesn't work. Engineers designing a car do not have to research what a wheel is or how they should be implemented. House builders do not have to make their own tools. In fiction, the rules are what point you in the direction that works without you having to learn the hard way. Genre expectations work in a similar manner. People who like a genre want more stories that excite them in the same ways. In no way are they a checklist for you to go through item by item while you write. They're supposed to aid you in conceptualizing your story, and then for you to look over alongside your story to make sure that fans of the genre will appreciate your work as well. On paper, it might seem like detective fiction is devoid of originality, but that's just simply not true. A writer who really knows the genre can look at all of the notes and rules and come up with a unique way to tell a story, while staying in the genre for the fans to enjoy it. Ultimately, that is always the mission. Writers who write for their own glory fail miserably. Writers who intend their stories to resonate with the target audience are the ones who are remembered. And on that note, keep writing.